Egun on guztioi, hasiera emango diegu gaurko jardunaldiari, horrela igual gerturatzen da jende gehiago etortzen ari dana. Isiltasun pixkat eskatzen dugu, mesedez, atzoko jardunaldia Kirekin. Eskerrik asko eman dizuegu etorri zareten guztioi, eskerrak ere eman jarraitzen ari zareten pertsona eta erakunde guztiei. Beraientzat, streaming bitartez jarraitzen ari direnentzat ere esatea asistentzia teknikoa izan.
I'd like to remind you
denok eskualtza eta mikrofona eskatu dezakezue, eta streaming bitartez jarraitzen ari.
those of you following us online via streaming, you can ask us questions through the chat, and those here can raise their hands. So if you need it, there are earphones outside, and those of us following us via streaming, you can change it at the top of the website. Okay, we wanted to continue with the motivation of this conference. Many of you know about it, but 4 years ago we wanted to do this, that are usually biannual, but then the pandemic happened. But now we're very happy because we've returned to it, and we think it's important for people to be able to be here present. We'd also like to welcome all the people invited to Isadora, Luisa Maria, Luisa, Yomis, Adam, Rita, and Amador. Also, a warm welcome to Mireia Cano, who's here on my left because her support has been fundamental to provide context for the topic and make the proposals for guests. We'd like to thank the people who are moderating this roundtable. We have Mireia Cano, and then we'll have Leire and Irancho, who will moderate their own roundtables. We're going to start with the presentation by Ximena. Then we'll have a small break, coffee break. After that, we'll hear more experiences. And then we'll have a lunch break with catering in the room neighboring this one. And after lunch, we'll return to continue with the roundtable of experiences, where we'll hear several experiences with Sokole, an entity with works with African percussion, and also a presentation of visual. We have visual elements. There on the left, you can see a person who will be creating a panel for each block of. Then we wanted to make it more participative. One of the murals is in the adjacent room where the catering will be. So anyone who wants to, maybe somebody thought of something, a proposal, anything creative, they can tell us or take it down there, and then we can show it when we finish the conference. We also have Kurusku, Andrea's recording, and via streaming, we have a camera to broadcast the event. If anyone has a problem, if you wish not to appear in the videos, you can tell us as follows. We have some yellow stickers at the table there with the earphones on. If you put on that sticker later on, we'll edit the video so these people do not appear in the video. We also have these accreditations to facilitate interactions among ourselves. So this way, we have the blue team, those of us who are part of the organizing team, so you know. Services, the toilets are leaving the room to the left, and then we'll have an online survey when Ximena finishes with our figures. Those who are participating here in person have the assessment sheet. We please ask you to fill it in before leaving the room. And also for those following us via streaming, there's a link so you can fill in the evaluation. Like in the cinema, please turn off your mobile phones. And the anti-militarist feminist group they'll be calling for a demonstration in Arriaga Square at 7:30. No wars killing us, no peace oppressing us. That's the slogan. We invite you to participate, to dialogue between us all. And now we'll start with Mireia Cano. She is the moderator of this section. She has a long career in issues as women and peace process. She's been a gender advisor in the peace process in Colombia for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She is currently an advisor for the inclusion of the gender perspective in peace consolidation processes in the Norwegian Center for Conflict Resolution. She has directed a number of gender assessments, among them the first thematic interagency assessment for gender equality in humanitarian action. As an editor, she's worked in the judgment division in the Hague Court. She has experience as an advisor in gender policies and development strategies. She's also a trainer in gender issues. She is a founder and main consultant of Cano Gender Solutions, providing advisory services on gender issues for UN nations and international NGOs, and in Norway. Thank you very much.
Empecemos bien. Pues muchas gracias y muy buenos días a todos y a todas. Yo antes quería agradecer sobre todo al Ayuntamiento de Bilbao y a la cooperación vasca por estas jornadas, porque detrás de estas entidades hay mucha gente que ha estado trabajando para que estemos...
Who are working so that we can be sitting in this room. People who have been thinking of the agenda, the lunch, the music, the graphic documentation. So thanks a lot for having us here today. I also wanted to thank the audience, both virtual and those who are here in the room, for taking the day to be here. And I wanted to invite you to do two things. First one is in this conference, I think it's very important to listen with an open mind. And I'd like to apologize with the interpreters because I don't know how they will deal with this. I don't know about the concept in Basque. But what I wanted to explain is we have very many ideas about gender, men, women. Yesterday, Isadora was telling us about children, boys, girls, different religions, different civil status. But I think all of us working with gender, we need to think of gender as creativity. We never have enough resources. We never have enough staff. We never have time in an emergency in order to carry out this gender work, which is so important. So in a conference like this one regarding gender and humanitarian action, having this open mind, I think is very important. And the second invitation is to meet 5 people. This is an idea from a gender conference I attended in Oslo 2 weeks ago, and the moderator invited us to meet 5 people. Not people working with the same NGO, but with the agency, or people we have never greeted before. When the moderator at Oslo invited us, I took it very seriously. I turned around and I told the lady sitting next to me, "Hi, my name is Mireia, how are you doing?" And the lady, she came from Pakistan with all her gear, her sunglasses. She was completely focused on the conference. And she told me about when she came from Pakistan to Oslo, about her family, her children, her husband. And then I asked her, "What do you do for a living? What's your work?" And she told me, "Well, I design sex toys." And it's amazing. And there I realized that I, as a gender advisor, I had my own ideas, stigmas, biases of that Pakistani woman in Oslo. So this is an insight because all of us working in humanitarian action, we also have these biases, these preconcepts, these ideas, and we think we know those people who are affected by an emergency. We believe we know what they need, what their priorities are, what they want, what they don't. But I think today the needs diagnosis lets us know that we don't know until we ask. And the idea of this tool is to ask and to listen with an open mind and be willing to adapt that humanitarian aid to what people tell us instead of what we think they need. And without further ado, I will introduce Ximena. Ximena is from Bolivia. She lives in Jaca, and she has 20 years professional experience. She started with projects of human rights and replacement of illicit crops in Bolivia. Now she's working as a coordinator at Care International. Her work is to help us learn, help us understand how we can move forward with our institutional commitments, and most of all, how the lives of people change with our interventions of humanitarian action, how to make these changes positive and sustainable for everyone. And that's why she's here today, to share this tool of gender diagnosis in order to inspire us in this work of wanting to learn more and wanting to go beyond. So, Ximena, you have the floor.
Necesito cambiar esto aquí. Solo un minutito.
I just need 1 minute to change something here and see if it works.
Ahí.
Sí, pero me estabas compartiendo, creo. Ahora está cogiendo. Vale, vamos a ver.
Pueden ir aprovechando para conocer a la persona que tienen al lado.
You can start and to talk to the person sitting next to you in these few minutes.
Estaba hace un rato, sí estaba. Ahora, perfecto, ok. Solo me instalo bien aquí para poder arrancar.
Okay, I will just start now. Good morning, everybody. Thanks a lot. Emphasizing what Mireia just mentioned, thanks to those people who have invited us and are having us here today in order to learn and to meet each other. Good morning, good afternoon to those who are attending online in other regions of the world. And we will start with the first session today. And the aim of this session, for those of you who were here last night, is to resolve that mystery that Isadora created about rapid gender analysis and how it is implemented, and see how it works in practice. For those of you who were not here last night, I will make a brief summary of what we discussed, but then I will get in depth into the details. And the idea is that you have a general idea of what a diagnosis is and how to implement it step by step. I will give some examples of operational challenges that we encounter in each of these stages, because as we saw yesterday, we work in very complex contexts, and there are challenges that come up in every diagnosis. Very briefly, at the end of the presentation, we will have a look at where the rapid gender diagnosis is situated as compared to other tools that we use in the cycle of humanitarian response. Everything I'm going to say, and Isadora mentioned as well, you can find it in these websites. The first one is all the resources in the toolkit for rapid gender analysis. It's in French, English, and Spanish, and these are all the tools, all the forms, everything used in the diagnosis, plus also some examples of diagnosis carried out in different parts of the world. And the second link relates to the capacitation program in diagnosis and training. You can access, I guess we can share the links later on with those of you participating. From the view of care and in the history of rapid gender analysis, there's 4 points which are very important for me. First one, when it started, when it was born, rapid gender analysis. Isadora is here. She's the bright mind behind the creation of rapid gender analysis in the context of Syria. Those of you who were in the conference last night, you've heard it. It was a very challenging context. We couldn't enter the country. Even the locals couldn't enter the country to do this diagnosis. It was born back in 2013 as an approach. How can we make this intervention? And as a toolkit, what tools can we use quickly in order to understand the gender situation in Syria in this case? That was back in 2013. In 2015, when the toolkit was consolidated, we also consolidated the training program. It's very accessible as a method, but it requires some training. So we have these measures to complement it. And 2018, the Permanent Interagency Committee, or IASC in English, makes it part of the Manual of Gender for Humanitarian Action. So it's a recognized tool, accessible for everyone, free access in different languages. So it is a tool for the sector rather than for a particular organization. In 2020, from CARE or CARE, well, in Spanish we say CARE, so I will say CARE, we carried out an external assessment with external advisors, and we gathered a sample of the diagnosis that had been done across the world, and we wanted to conclude what have we learned, what have we achieved, and what are the future challenges. So that's the timeline. And we have to recognize that when carrying out a rapid gender analysis, we start from recognizing that crises are not gender neutral, and we have the intention of exploring that, and they have an impact on different actors. This from the basic idea of how men, women, boys, girls are impacted, but also getting into other aspects of our identity, our class, our ethnic group, our social, economic group, migration group, etc. And we also discussed yesterday, when carrying out a diagnosis, we will look at the disequalities that have been emphasized, what has become worse as a result of the crisis. But also, we have to bear in mind that there are opportunities, what changes have come up in gender equality, what are the steps that we have ahead of us. Some key elements of rapid diagnosis, I will just summarize what we mentioned last night. It is quick, and the intention is that it has to be appropriate, and the need for it to be dynamic and quick and taking advantage of everything that is available, or if we have to gather information, we need to go to the key information. It's progressive. There are several iterations. We start with what we have, what we consider good enough at some point, and then we move forward from there. So we have to embrace imperfection and understand it and assume it, and be very clear about how imperfect about our diagnosis might be. We had an example in Nigeria, one of our diagnoses there, who were very explicit at the beginning. We said only adults from 20 to 65-year-olds. We are not looking at children, adolescents. We are not looking at people with functional capabilities. And in the areas where we want to carry out the diagnosis, it's not feasible to try and address this. So we try to look at this group from 20 to 65 years old. So this is limited from the very beginning. It has to be practical as well. The recommendations have to be adequate for the technicians, the different technicians involved, and they also have to complement what the sectors already know about the gender dynamics. For instance, the installation of toilets different for men and women. Maybe in the sector this is already defined. But what about those people with disabilities? And this is something we can extract from the gender diagnosis. So we add layers to the previous analysis. finally, no, well, two more points. It has to be applicable to different levels. We have global level, for instance, for COVID, there was a global diagnosis. We have regional levels, Mekong, Latin America. These are crises that deal with regions or sub-regions, and we have national level, a whole country, and then more specific crises for a subnational level. And these all have very different objectives. We want to understand the gender situation to change things to do with politics, with donors, with ways in which donors provide resources or diagnoses which are very operational. I want to know how to change the distribution of food, and then it is related to different levels. And finally, to me, the rapid gender analysis is very important because it's a huge opportunity to learn by doing. In my case in particular, I'm not specialist in gender, but it's been an opportunity to increase my ability, my gender competences, my abilities, skills in gender. And I can translate it into measuring, into finding, and I think this is a very important value. If we look at the content of rapid gender analysis, this is the scheme of what we would see in a document. It tries to address roles and gender responsibilities in the context of the crisis, always by comparing what happened before the crisis and what's going on now. Facing mechanisms and capacity, and here in Ethiopia, if there's a drought, the men have to go somewhere else to other places in order to find resources. So these, so what mechanisms do they use? Or women who have just entered the workforce because they need to. So what dynamics are changing there? Access to services, access to health, LGBT populations who have access, for instance, in Nepal, they have no documents because of their identity. What are the repercussions of this within Nepal, or if they get out of their country? As for participation, in Ukraine, we've seen that women are participating much more in informal spaces like volunteers, local organizations in this context, which are closer, but due to the military situation, they are not participating in the public sphere. They don't have a direct participation in this space. So we have to make this situation visible along the diagnosis. Protection, yesterday Isadora mentioned gender-based violence is nearly for sure in all crises it gets emphasized, but we have to address it very carefully because gathering data is linked to, in this context, has very many technical and ethical explications and of safety as well, but we have to address it from the from a view of safety. What's the degree of mobility of a person if they go to the toilet or if they go to fetch water? And finally, needs and aspirations. Yesterday we said, how can you address aspirations in a context of emergency? It's here, it's the short term, but in diagnosis like in Palestine, we are talking about long-term crisis, and where you can address aspirations, and an example was adolescent women talking about their vision, about the access to training, education, or learning and economic activity. So it's a situation of emergency, but those aspirations can tell us where the recovery should go to or how to give a response that will allow us to channel those aspirations. And finally, as we mentioned, it has to be very punctual to the sector.
I just want to leave this, as Isadora mentioned yesterday, in the green part of the diagnosis, we try to simplify the gender language to make it more accessible to the general public. On the left, in grey, this is the gender analysis framework of care. As you can see, the 8 points here, it's a dense language when you read the document, you need to have more of a notion of gender in general to be able to revise all these things in depth. So what the message here is what gender analysis tries to simplify, addressing the issues that need to be addressed, but simplifying how we handle these terms and trying to go in deeper where we want to go. Recommended times for an RGA. This is very general, but it has to adapt to the conditions of each place. In theory, if we have humanitarian response, we need regular preparation cycles. We need a disaster preparation, and then we need to have an idea about gender. What are the conditions, the relationships, and the context of the countries? So in theory, in our emergency preparation, we already have information. We understand the contexts and the pre-crisis conditions. The crisis starts, and after 48 hours, what we do is update that information that in theory we already had, or which we have to create from scratch, but all from secondary data. And we try to understand, well, it's this country or this location, and I'll go into more details later. 2 weeks later, in theory, we've already been able to review secondary data. We've seen reports, sectoral diagnoses, what the United Nations and other agencies are doing. We have local information in other languages, which often have more important information than what we can find in English or in other languages. And we have an initial diagnosis with secondary data, and 6 weeks later, if we progress towards obtaining primary data through surveys or additional data, we would have a complete report. I wanted to highlight what Isadora mentioned yesterday. This is the key moment, 48 hours. Their donors make decisions what's going to be funded. Our own agencies or organizations decide how we're going to act. So this thing about having a quick idea of what the gender situation is key to have it from the start, and which will be confirmed or complemented as we complete the diagnosis. And if we're lucky, after the humanitarian disaster, there'll be an assessment of the response overall, where we bring up questions about the diagnosis to see if we've addressed it properly or not. The steps to carry out an RGA are 5. I'll describe these 5 steps one by one, but this is the initial framework that where the toolkit has been conceptualized. We start by searching. This is the first step, to understand the gender now and in the moment of pre-crisis. This comes out from the preparation stage, as I mentioned, or in the moment, but we need to understand what everything was like before the crisis. And the idea is to be able, with existing data, to highlight these things here and to pay attention to gender roles and responsibilities, what's the story with education and economic empowerment, political participation, and so on. Here at the top, this is more recent, it's from Ukraine, and it can be as simple as an infograph. And it's just understanding the country, understanding that it's a country with a majority of women, understanding that there are these populations, these age groups, understanding that women are more dependent on social aid programs when they're in retirement age, understanding that in theory these are the statistics on disabled people, but when you compare the last 2 censuses, they're exactly the same figures, so there's something going on there, but we can identify these kinds of things with existing information. Down here it's Iraq, which is a more extensive document made with Oxfam. It could be 2 to 10 pages, depending on how much they want to prepare, but it's more narrative. But again, the idea is that it enables us to understand the context. Then we move into the collection stage. So from what we already know, we've collected some information, but we have to collect more. We start with secondary data, what's available. We review a lot of documents, everything we can find, and based on what we've mapped from different documents, we say, okay, let's look at some of them in more depth. We need to draw additional information. We need to go in to the context of the crisis and be able to focus on specific groups, if necessary, in populations which there are no data for, or in populations that we have to understand because there's contradictory information. Maybe the UN report, I've seen cases like this. There's a report with an interagency diagnosis and it draws one conclusion on women's role in decision-making in the home versus another research carried out at the same time which draws different conclusions. So collecting primary data helps you to confirm that or not. It's not statistically perfect. It's not designed to be so, but you just want to look at where you're going to research and what you want to do. Here we have intersectionality, so you cover different layers. You want to see women who are in single-parent homes, who are caring for disabled people, and so on. You add layers to look at who you're going to look for, so to speak, to collect information. As Mireia said, we never take anything for granted. We never assume we know the answers because there are always surprises. And one example for me was, I think it was Nepal, where in food safety conditions, we saw that most people were losing access to food due to COVID. But due to a certain situation, one village was improving its decision regarding food. They ate healthier. They had reprioritized the way in which they used foods. So again, there are things that can surprise you. Here, it's important, responsible handling of data. All the data collection involves responsibility. So you have to make sure that people are in a safe environment and that they want to participate. And I can give you examples here. These icons are within the package of tools. These are different options there are. These are focus groups. So you invite groups. They could be women, facilitated also by a woman, to create more safety in the area, in the space. You can disaggregate them by ages and so on. You can carry out surveys, the typical survey. You give them a form which they fill in while you interview them, or it could be, you can use technological means now. It could be direct observation. There are guidelines for this in the package of tools. It can be an interview with a key informer. They can be stories. Isadora mentioned yesterday is one of the tools that she likes the most, how you can draw individual stories that can help you understand the emergency. And you can carry out more graphical analysis. This is on freedom of movement in a camp, for example, and how a woman has access to the tent, to her neighbors, to the toilet facilities, the market, and so on, to understand mobility, how people move around. Here, factors to be taken into account are, for me, something that's been highlighted is you decide what method you're going to use depending on the context, but you also have to be open to changing plans. In Nigeria, when collecting data, we'd promoted the use of technological tools. We have an application which is called Voice Up, which is while you're carrying out the interview, it generates text. It transcribes into text. And you can kind of catalog certain answers so that the analysis is simpler. Technologically, it's great because it allows you to collect information and then use it for analysis. But what can also happen is that the person you're interviewing, you progress through the interview and they say, I don't want to continue. I'm not convinced by how you're asking me these questions. I'm seeing the text there. I don't want to continue. Or we go in with the technology and the women say, I want you to interview me, but with my neighbor beside me. And the neighbor enhances what I'm saying. So there's noise, so to speak, in the dynamic of the interview. So it's no longer reliable with one person, but it's the neighbor who's also intervening. So technology and the resources you use, everything that's available now is great, but you need to take into account that plans can change. In digital media, what you can talk about with a person in 15 minutes can turn into 30 or 45 minutes in using digital media. You need to take this into account. Sometimes you want to carry out a 5-question survey, but in reality, you only be able to do 2. So there's a lot of that, and this should be taken into account when collecting data. Examples, just to give you a couple. This is a typical survey. Yesterday they were asking what kind of questions are asked. So this is a typical survey where the interviewer fills it in as they hold an interview with someone on linked to gender roles, what needs they have. Here to the left, focus groups, examples of questions that you can ask when you're with a group of people. I chose a question randomly here. It's more of a dialogue. You're asking open questions and trying to create a dialogue. This down here is a story of change. It's for an individual person. So what's happened for you? Why is this change important? What does this mean for you? And then also based on that, you can move on to other actors, but here you focus on the person. 2 significant challenges here. In general, when we collect data, we want to know what has changed, but very often we forget about what impact it's had. What's happened? What's changed is that there's no food. People are losing their jobs. What's changed is that there's no access to water. But how does it impact me is a deeper story. So we try to make that the second question and go into details about how this has impacted their lives. There's no food. I don't eat because I have to feed my children. There's no water. There are long queues in the morning, so I go at night. So therefore, there's more risk. So that's the second question, how it's impacted the people. And another challenge that I've seen is that in a situation of emergency, a person will always try to communicate what's happening to their family, what's happening to their community, because it affects a lot of people at the same time. It's hard to go down to the individual, but that's what we want to do as well. So we always try to balance that. Point number 3, for me the most challenging, is analysis. You have a lot of data, you have a lot of documentation, you have very little time, as Isadora said yesterday. Maybe a colleague starts the analysis at 8 in the morning until 4. At 4, it passes it on to Australia so they can continue, then it goes to America. But somebody has to continue with it because this has to move forward. A lot of sources, maybe there are contradictory cases, so you have to make executive decisions on some of the conclusions that you want to reach, and it's good. I think we have to feel comfortable. Here's an example. We have to question the data. If we don't trust a piece of data, we have to be able to express it in the gender diagnosis. As I said, if there are 2 censuses that give you the exact same figures over a period of 2 years, something's not right. So you need to be able to highlight this in the diagnosis. The difference of perspectives, what's 6 for one person is a 9 for another. So you need to know how to show them in the diagnosis, but we need to try and reach a conclusion. In the end, we're always going to have different perspectives. So this needs to help us reach a conclusion. And this graph, I'm very biased towards data because that's the field I work in very often. This is the issue. Generally, we have data which are in different places and different topics. Sometimes we manage to connect them if we're lucky. The idea in the gender diagnosis is based on all that data to draw findings. So you have these little small lights here. And ideally, is if we reach this point here, and it's the example I gave some while ago, there's no food, therefore I don't eat, therefore my food safety is bad, so you try to link all the implications this has for people. And that's where I think the biggest challenge is, because analyzing data is kind of an art, and drawing conclusions from all that and knowing what to leave to one side, and that's a tough decision. What am I going to leave out from everything I've found? So how is this seen when you carry out analysis of data? You can visualize it as in graphs. This is for Ukraine, the needs of people, and the differences between men and women. Women are in yellow and men are in blue. As we highlighted yesterday, depending on who you talk to, their perception of what's more important is very different. Here, the level of protection, men and women feel the same need. But when you talk about income or employment, or you talk about shelter, it's a very different reality between men and women. This is just talking about men and women, but you can see you have very different starting points. And up here, this is more the narrative side. You have general findings, like this here. They say the crisis is exacerbating pre-existing inequalities. This isn't even new, but it must be made clear in the diagnosis. And here I didn't include the whole text because it's long, but the diagnosis describes how disproportionate this is for certain groups. So this is how we narrate our findings for different groups. Obviously, after this paragraph, we have what happens with the displaced people, what happens to LGBTI populations, and so on. This is another example. It's in English, but this is just to give you an example. This is from Bangladesh. And again, we carry out an analysis. We have so much information, we need to reach specific points. So what have we found, which could be a bit more general, and some that are very specific based on the findings we have and the difficulties. In this case, women, children, transgender people. So trying to focus on specific things. Point 4, drafting recommendations. As we said yesterday, there are two types of recommendations we can make. One type, which providing an answer. This is what we have to do. Barriers and challenges. For an example, changing the distribution point of water, changing the food distribution point because they're not in the right place, they're not accessible, they're not safe. Changing the distribution of latrines. Change how information on gender-based response services are located. And the second, more linked to opportunities, are recommendations that can be transformative, taking advantage of positive, quote-unquote, changes that may have been brought by the crisis, thinking about what this might mean in the recovery phase. So we're seeing that local women's organizations are being mobilized, so we try to look at what's going to happen with this, what should be done with this, because there's potential. So in the recovery phase, what role will women play? Are they going to participate in decision-making? How are we going to move on to the next phases? As you will see in diagnoses, there are very specific recommendations for individuals or entities. The water cluster should be this. The humanitarian sector of the United Nations and Consortium X should do this or that. Local actors, care and their technical team, etc. So they're more specific when they're aimed at a specific actor, then formulated with others. This is also my experience when you've analyzed data and you're reviewing and saying, what can we do with water and drainage? Talking with a technician is very valuable. You say, look, this is emerging from my analysis. Does it make sense or not? So you're not making recommendations that are not technically unfeasible or absurd in some cases because you don't have expertise in this field. And here, this is not common practice, but it's something we're debating now. You draft the recommendation, it's going to be released, and you have to suggest how will this recommendation be followed up, because you launch the recommendation with the best hopes and intentions for it to be applied, but then there's no current mechanism to say, yes, it has been adopted or not, and what's going to be done about it. These are examples of recommendations. I'm not going to read them all, but just to give you a brushstrokes of what to expect from the recommendations. This first one was a diagnosis carried out in Palestine, and its intention was to inform, it was with OCHA, and it was to inform on the humanitarian response plan. So in this sense, a recommendation of this kind is very rational, with saying that the goals of this plan we should include goals to work with organizations led by women or organizations to work on women's rights. It's very broad as a recommendation, but it makes sense as a humanitarian strategy. In the case of Ukraine, for example, one broad recommendation, a high-level recommendation, is just a recommendation that donors, when handing in funds for Ukraine, make sure that there are gender analyses in the responses that they're financing. Again, it's very broad, but it's very relevant for the context in the need to address it among all humanitarian actors. And then we move down. This is in the Mekong area, and it's more specific for the Mekong. And in this diagnosis, it was common to different countries, the issue of protection services for sex workers. So you can do something more specific around this population, what can be done, and it is cross-cutting. In other countries down here, these are more detailed. This is Ethiopia, and the issue of involving men and children in humanitarian action. We saw that in Ethiopia as a result of the drought. Men are under more pressure to provide for their families. There's polygamy in some areas, so there are many places that men have to care for. Migratory issues, they have to go to other places to get income, and they're excluded from humanitarian action. They're considered a vulnerable population in that sense. So here's a very specific recommendation. We have to bring men back in to the response areas, considering the situation they're facing. So here, again, you see the most vulnerable, but also those may be considered less vulnerable, but their action can affect the whole humanitarian context.
Sharing, finally, is the issue of having a plan. What shall we do with the diagnosis once we have it in our hands? How are we going to share it? Who's the final user, etc.? This is just a copy of what might be a plan of sharing. And there you define who will you share it with, and you won't share the whole document. You have to select key messages and what recommendations. So I'm going to talk to United Nations, then I will deliberately focus on recommendations that will be related to them, that call them. I'm going to talk to the response team, local response team, and I go to the operational aspect and see what we can solve there. And what we have learned with the assessment of RGA in 2020, with this external assessment we carried out, is that we see that just by sharing and debating and discussing gender analysis can have impact on different spaces. This was in the United Nations with the global RGA on COVID, and we can say we have had an influence on the way decisions have been made at global level, decision-making and a global level. So just by sharing, beyond sending it by mail, you have to be intentional in discussing the data. I'm nearly closing my presentation. Where are we as CARE? And the big debate we are having is whether we should have, and this is the plan, to have a 0.6. 0.6 is like the states, I was saying, wonderful recommendations. We have a document which is very practical. In diagnosis, we are very proud of how much it can inform for humanitarian response, but what happens after the recommendations? Who's going to do it? Who's going to be in charge? How do we know it's been implemented? What recommendations have been followed? Which ones have not? We have to be aware of this, and we have to do this exercise, thinking of this stage 6. Maybe after having the document, the ideal thing would be that the response team sits down and they decide, according to its recommendation, which one they will follow, which one they will address. And they have the commitment to incorporate it in the activity of the project, and you can measure it, you can assess it, and which deliberately where we are not addressing. This is transparency as well, and this is accountability around the whole process. So now we are debating this. What's the tool for this last stage? And we are looking at a system of classification again, which ones go, which ones are not feasible. And based on that, we have to do some monitoring and the impact of these recommendations. And that's where we know we have a weakness and we want to address it. 2 more slides and I will just finish. Mireia, from our experience with CARE, I could say that the rapid gender analysis has been an opportunity, big opportunity, that a tool that it's not mandatory, it's not compulsory. In CARE, it's not compulsory, but it's become a common practice. And this is so because after Syria, Sudan, the organization has seen that it is highly useful for humanitarian responses. So organically, the teams have started using it. Nobody is forcing it. There's no protocol. It's not compulsory, but it's become part of our organizational culture. As a result, we can say that we are making better responses following the assessments. We adapt our responses. Of course, it's not an ideal situation, but we adapt responses. We can prove there's activities and decisions that are made after having this diagnosis, gender diagnosis. We have improved our way of handling data. We are better at searching and collecting data. In the analysis, sometimes we are a bit small, and there we have to keep improving. And then, again, having findings, having insights about this data. We have improved our diagnosis with others, along with other people. So those with other partners or with local organizations are the best and the ones most valuable to us and most valuable to other people as well. And as I mentioned before, it's become a mechanism of influence using RGAs with different organizations. We still have to do some work on the impact side. We have a better response, but still we cannot prove it. We don't have the whole mechanisms to measure the impact within a response, humanitarian response. So we have to, if we have improved the way we deliver food, we cannot really say whether it has improved the way people are eating. So we don't have this connection done yet. If the diagnosis is a race, is it a race or a marathon? After a race, we are exhausted. Then when we are going to start the next stage, and how much can you stand running like that when you have a humanitarian response and a very difficult context? So how much energy do you have? About data analysis, how many data can we consume and analyze? Because we collect much more than we can digest, so to speak. So where do we stop in what we want to collect? Debates as to whether it makes sense to have a rapid gender analysis, or maybe we should focus on the diagnosis of sectorial needs. My position here is that the rapid gender analysis gives you guidelines that the others don't. So they're complementary, and we need to do both. And the agility of RGA is that it can complement some blind points in the sectorial assessments. And lastly, the budget issue. We have limited resources usually, unless the response program has considered this issue from the very beginning. This is my last slide. Rapid gender analysis, as I mentioned at the beginning, lives with many other tools for gender integration. This is a very simplified version of the life of a project. First, you have the design or conception stage, the definition and planning, the launch or execution, performance and control, and then you close the project. This is a very simple way of putting it. Rapid gender analysis starts here, and it will have different iterations over the project, but it starts here. This is the starting point. But while you're doing this, you see there's a need to have access to financial resources, and then you move on to the integration model. And then you work with the involvement of men and boys, and you have to get in depth in some aspects. At the same time, you want to know, as an organization, whether all these commitments, gender commitments, are being carried out. In CARE, we use the gender indicator marker. It belongs to the sector, and we have adapted it to humanitarian action. And this is compulsory. It's compulsory. All the projects in the world apply this gender marker in their design and implementation. So it's a way to know that if we are thinking all of this is something that is having a transformational effect. And then we have the impact measurement. There will be an evaluation and assessment after the action that hopefully will recover the elements of the diagnosis as well. I will not get into detail here, but there's a whole universe beyond diagnosis. So it's a very complex scene, but they are linked one to another, and as you can see, it makes sense and it's easier to see it. So, and this is where I end my presentation. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thanks a lot, Ximena. Well, now we have half an hour for questions, comments, experiences that the audience may want to share. I know the first question is always a difficult one, but no, well, we have one in there. Okay. Yes? We have received an online question which says, "Hi, my name's Greta Frankenfeld. I don't know if that's how I pronounce it. From Kalala, Fond of Women." This is a very appropriate conference. Thanks a lot for this very interesting presentation. And she asks, what's the role of organization, local feminist women's organizations? Do they have a team devoted to data collecting from different places? Thank you. Okay, let's take another two questions and then Ximena will answer.
So regarding point 5, which is step 5, which is the plan, you come up with the plan. Is it possible to add a column for budgeting, so you can have more concrete? My second question is this, as a local organization, not international as CARE or other organization, is this tool is enough for donors? Is it liable? And according to, like we come up with a plan, a list of intervention. According to what criteria you set your priorities for intervention? And thank you.
Tal vez para ahí, porque
Sí.
sí.
Ximena, pues dale.
Okay, voy a empezar aquí.
Okay, I'll start here. As to the first question about the role of local feminist organizations, I'd say the role you allow them to play and to what extent you have an influence in gender diagnosis. We have experiences where they have been done with big institutions and they've been linked to OCHA, and these are the involved actors. Or we have diagnoses where these local organizations have been much more important for two reasons. One, their knowledge of the context. This obviously will help you make a more appropriate diagnosis, and also promote opportunities of local organizations. They have usually a very good plan, maybe not the financing, but Isadora mentioned yesterday the Women Lead program. That's the spirit. You involve women in the diagnosis, but they know well also how to channel the future response. As for teams collecting data, it depends very much on the country. Our teams in Bangladesh have as in infrastructure which is enough to have a team prepared for any type of data collection. They go from one place to another and they can support this data collection. And then there's teams like in Nigeria where you have to use external teams and you have to train people before collecting this data in decision making. We cannot collect data because about gender violence, for instance, because we don't have trained people for that. So you have to define these things according to the capacities and what's available in the country. About the question on budget in plans, it's a very good suggestion. I think it does make sense to disseminate and share also has some economic cost. I haven't done it in the diagnosis where I've participated, but I think it does make sense. So it's very relevant to add this suggestion. How believable is it to donors, whether you're a local organization or not? I think it's reliable. I think your rapid gender analysis is reliable, and you can think, we know that it's been implemented in 70 countries. It's used by the United Nations, OCHA, the big countries, but it is also done by local organizations. And I think they're equally reliable because the methodology is the same. The criterion to define what activities you're going to carry out based on recommendations, I think there's very many related to the technical criterion in the project. You have the diagnosis, you have the response team, and they discuss what is feasible, what is non-feasible. And sometimes we tend to go to the simplest recommendations, operationally more simple to carry out, and you don't need to do a very big effort. And sometimes we leave out the complex ones. So we have to challenge those complex recommendations, how to address them, how to select them. And in my experience, we also have to make visible those ones we are leaving out and the implications it may have to leave those ones out. It's something we have to be aware of, that we've made some executive decisions. Sometimes this is linked to the budget or maybe to recommendations that we will not implement, but we have to bring them to other sectors. And then there's an effort to disseminate. I have to go and talk to United Nations, to Oxfam, to feminist organizations, because there's something we have to do about these recommendations. Thank you. Any more questions, comments?
Good morning. I'm Rashid from Port. My question is actually about coordination when we are talking about collecting primary data. As you know, like in the times of crisis, we are not alone. There are a lot of actors, UN agencies, INGOs, and different actors. They want to collect information. And like coordination maybe will help in avoiding overwhelming people with different questions and like asking the question many times. During like 1 week, there are like hundreds of organizations trying to get information from the same families. And maybe they are under pressure. Of course they are under pressure, not maybe. And they need assistance, and they are looking for like services while we are overwhelming them with data collection. I want to know, like out of your experience, how did you go around this barrier? Like, I mean, it is very difficult to coordinate at the very beginning of the time of the crisis, but it is very essential as well, like to sit together and see how we will approach these people. I mean, this is was the main barrier for us, and people were complaining about the amount of information requested from them, and then they say like, you are only asking for information and we get nothing in return because we need to put in a proposal and then ask for the budget, and this will take time. And maybe this, for one reason or another, like the credibility of the organization will be affected because they don't know who is asking and who is giving the support. Thank you.
Let's take one more. ¿Una pregunta más? Pasamos ahí.
Sí, hay otra Mireia.
Muchas gracias por la presentación. Soy Iván Ascasíbar de Acción.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. I'm Ivan Ascasíbar. I have a very particular question about this moment, this phase of data collection. Do you use, or are you thinking of using in the future big data technology that may help collect, find patterns, not only in a particular diagnosis, but in all the diagnoses? And is there learning in this area?
Voy aquí. Okay. Perfecto. Sobre coordinación.
About coordination, I'm going to be very based on my own experience, so if you have other experiences, we are here to listen to them. I completely agree with you. Generally, there's an overlap and we double efforts for collecting data. A situation where I've participated not with rapid diagnosis, but in other kind of assessment in Bolivia, in my own country. We've seen that the moment when the crisis started, we sat together, the organizations involved in that region, and we tried to distribute the questions or what we could ask. So CARE had the questions linked to gender, because this is our expertise field. The questions that we know were breaches of information in all the sectorial diagnoses. So we were given, so to speak, a certain type of questions linked to gender that were not being dealt with by other organizations. And in sectorial diagnosis, they started to do some interagency work. If Oxfam and another agency were dealing with water, they had agreed that it had to be a common diagnosis. It takes a long time of coordination, but in my experience, this is one of the cases where you can do it. Another one I've seen, which has drawn my attention in Ukraine recently, there's a very specific recommendation asking for donors that all organizations that have funding have to deliver their data and have to make their diagnosis accessible. And I think this is a very important point, very interesting. If a donor gives you funds, they require you have to deliver data for the sector, for other agencies, according to the diagnosis that you do. I haven't seen this in other places, but it has really certainly drawn my attention. I think sometimes it's difficult not to overlap, but it depends on how intentional you are when you sit at the table with other organizations, and also to assume responsibilities, what I will be doing myself as needs diagnosis. About moving on to the other question about data analysis for big data and in passive way, I'd say we are not ready. Our way of collecting data has a different quality, thinking of RGA in this case. Big data and aggregated data is something you can see in the humanitarian sector. They help understand the mobility of people and they help understand where you focus your humanitarian response according to the way the population is moving around. And in order to define interventions, yes, in order to extract learning and knowledge from rapid gender analysis, we are still in the previous stage. We are first trying to see what our database are, see how they are structured, and see if we can pull all of them together in the same format. Technologically, each team is using whatever they can. Some use Excel, some others have some sophisticated tools, some others are more narrative. So we have many differences. Where do these data live?
Pregunta.
Hello, good morning. Fernando Almanza, an independent consultant. I like the presentation a lot, but I like also like what you said about yourself as an expert, and also according to what Amador and others have said, I see kind of a duality. On the one hand, what's local and international, and that also means power, and drawing data and analysis. And in one of the cases you talked about is there's a lot of capacity to extract data, and analysis capacity is limited. In my experience over many years working with local organizations is that analysis is very clear. It's difficult. It's different if they find it difficult to put it in an acceptable language for donors. The analysis is valid even if donors and international agencies don't understand it, and abusing the extraction of data drowns local organizations, local populations who are overwhelmed by so much analysis, well, mainly data extraction. And then on the property of the tool and methodologies, I would like to know if you could tell us how this is being done, not to disseminate in that network. I've been a part of this for many years. Oxfam, CARES, Save the Children, and all these big fish, as you call them. But how do we get rid of all that capacity and hand it down to local organizations and let them use it however they want and with whatever language they want to use, and donors can listen to them and according to the language of the local reality, not forcing local people to be able to speak the international language or better or English or with these presentations. I don't say this as criticism, but it's a reflection, because I think the topic here is to see how we can improve things. And I was listening to you as a person with years of experience, and you have these dilemmas. I think we have to start to seriously think about them. Thank you.
¿Hay otra online? Sí, nos llegan de...
We've received a comment from Annalisa Lenti from the NGO Alboan, who says, on the coordination between agencies, thus the importance of intersectoral work, education working group, protection working group, and so on, to not duplicate efforts. That on the one hand. On the other, from the government of the Balearic Islands, Carmen Ortega says something that was already said yesterday by Isadora, and it says, hello, I'd like to ask about the possibilities opened for women in situations of crisis. For example, in the World War II, many women had access to jobs that they previously couldn't do, and which were they saw easier access. Can you give me an example of a similar situation? Thank you. Okay, on duality and analysis and the language, I fully agree. I think part of the debate is also acknowledging these things. I fully agree as to how extractive we are, and that's natural throughout the system, not only humanitarian, it's development, it's political science, everything. We believe that perfection is in knowing everything, and we don't have the ability to assimilate, digest, or analyze all the data that we collect. Personally, I think we're saturated with data in general throughout the sector. Now, regarding local organizations, this is my personal appreciation. Local organizations or actors or teams know the context perfectly well. They know perfectly well the reality through their experience and perspective. I think that it might be useful to use data from different sources on what exists in different languages and so on, so that they themselves can see if what they think is confirmed or if their understanding is confirmed. As we saw in that graph for Ukraine, local men and women think very differently about what's necessary right now. So that can bias your interpretation of how you understand and analyze the data. You have your own bias when analyzing data. So I wouldn't rule out that local actors have a better ability to make findings on the situation of emergency. But we should contrast this with existing data. I think it should be a good exercise. I totally agree with what you say about language. We want everything in English, and we think that all the information is only in English, when in reality it's local languages that have the wealth of information. So it's a commitment that if you're going to talk about gender, you need to speak with local language to draw data. As for the tool, linked to what Isadora mentioned yesterday, in our experience at CARE, it's linked to the fact that the tool is free, it's relatively simple. It should be channeled towards organizations led by women, and that commitment we're making for women to take leadership in humanitarian responses, and this can be a tool that they can use. And as you say, they can simplify it however they want, as they deem appropriate. But the package is there, and we think it works. We have enough evidence to see that it works and that it's manageable for local actors too. Concerning, well, the comment by interagency coordination, I'll repeat, I totally agree. The issue of clusters is very important to be able to coordinate gender diagnoses. And women in situations of crisis, I'm going to bring out my examples again, because I know there's an example of that somewhere here. So examples that I've seen linked to that. Women, due to the need, due to necessity, access the labor market. We're seeing a lot more of this in conflict areas or in situations, or in emergency situations, where I'd taken down 2 examples here in Palestine. I had the example from Ethiopia. It's due to drought, so they have to move to other economic activities. Or in the case of Palestine, women who join the formal and remunerated workforce. I think it's a challenge that we're seeing in several crises. We've seen this with COVID a lot as well. Women have taken on much more of the care load. They've taken care of schooling children, caring for older people, leaving their jobs temporarily. In some contexts, it has also meant that looking for income, they've joined the formal labor market when they didn't before. So returning to yesterday's topic, we have to look for these opportunities. Just like we see the negative effects of the crisis, we have to be alert to these opportunities. There's another question. I think we'll take one more question and then we'll finish with that. So go ahead. Gurucha Izpurua writes to us from, thank you very much for the presentation. I thought it was brilliant. Yesterday, your colleague mentioned that the rapid gender analysis isn't the most appropriate tool in long-term crises. However, in our experience, in the case of immigrant caravans, we see that gender analysis with populations in transit means you need you need to be very quick, sometimes just a day. My question is it possible in your experience to do this with such little time? What experience would it be worth knowing about, in your opinion? An experience that comes to mind is Ethiopia. We have the drought crisis, which is constant and which has recently been joined by COVID, conflicts. So you have peaks, as Isadora said, where rapid gender analysis can be very appropriate. You have droughts and so on, but then you have these peaks. So for me, the value of the RGA is that sometimes you have this long-term drought, but the diagnosis will automatically help you to look at specific moments where you have these peaks and where you can draw recommendations that are relevant for that peak. For instance, for COVID, for a natural event, a conflict that's emerged somewhere. So I agree with Isadora in that in long-term crisis you need a much deeper gender analysis that goes into the general context. And I use the RGA for the peaks to see maybe you need an intervention that has to come on top of what there already is in place due to the long-term crisis. Thank you very much for the questions and comments. We still have the rest of the day. I hope there are many more questions and comments. In fact, I think some of the questions will also be answered in the different presentations later on. We'll hear about the context of Colombia. We have Venezuelans crossing the border, where there could be a similar situation to that of the last question. So I'd just like to end this presentation with that invitation made by Ximena to familiarize ourselves with the diagnosis tool on needs. I don't know if the different organizations here have their own tool. I think it's good to exchange tools, to take from one, or try to see how to continue improving these tools. And I'd like to remind you that why is it important to carry out this diagnosis of needs? And yesterday we started talking about how crises have a very different impact on women, men, boys and girls, and how our diagnosis helps us to understand those needs that have been exacerbated and also the capacities. And then how? Well, through a tool which, as Ximena said, is a rapid tool. It's progressive, imperfect, practical. It's a tool that promotes diversity of methods. We're talking about focus groups, interviews, surveys, and also in coordination with other actors, as Rashid mentioned in his comment, understanding what has changed, but also how it has, what impact it has had on people. Bring back that word of impact that we're sometimes scared of as it's so big, but we need to understand it to be able to provide a quality response. The recommendation needs to be specific and practical. They need to be aimed at an actor, and they need to be technically feasible. And then sharing and socializing intentionally, releasing data for the sector at the request of the donors, as we're seeing in Ukraine, and also, as Fernando said, for and with local actors. The diagnosis has to inform the response. What recommendations are we going to give? And maybe taking a risk in those more complex recommendations. And we also need that transparency to say, well, we won't be able to do this. Maybe another organization can implement this recommendation. And with that, I think we'll leave it there and we can have a coffee. Thank you very much.
Tenemos media hora. ¿Se me oye?
Sí, hasta las
Tenemos media hora hasta las 11.
We have half an hour until 11 in the neighboring room.